What's going on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here, and I want to talk to you about an X-Men book that I finished reading recently. Uncanny X-Men, The End of History. This is Chris Claremont's return to the Uncanny X-Men title right after Extreme X-Men ended. All of the X-Men titles kind of went through a bit of a shuffle in the creative teams, and Chris Claremont wound up on the original Uncanny X-Men title with most of the characters that he had been working on Extreme X-Men. There are a few minor changes. He doesn't have Rogue and Gambit anymore. By this point, they were now on Chuck Austin's adjectiveless X-Men, and he has Nightcrawler, who was on Uncanny X-Men before Claremont was writing. And basically, if you'll recall, in the last couple of volumes of Extreme X-Men, Claremont was setting up this premise of this particular team of mutants. They have federal jurisdiction, basically all over the world, and their goal is to take care of mutant problems. They are mutant police officers saying that no mutant is above the law, and that was the premise that was being set up over the last couple of volumes in Extreme X-Men. And if you went back and you read the entire Extreme X-Men series, you might notice that that premise doesn't ever really get used. It's set up there, but it's never used in that series. It's used here. And I've said a few times that Claremont's Uncanny run, this particular run on Uncanny, is kind of like just a sequel to Extreme X-Men. Like, you could read Extreme X-Men and then just jump right into this batch of Uncanny X-Men comics, and it would more or less be like you're reading the same series. It is a little different, though. This is something I never noticed before, and I've read all of these Uncanny X-Men comics before, but I had never noticed there is a difference in this batch of Uncanny and Extreme X-Men that Chris Claremont was writing just a couple months earlier. The big difference is the villains that Claremont uses. In Extreme X-Men, there were a couple of old villains that he was returning to. Tullamore Vogue, or Vogue, he was a character he had introduced in Uncanny X-Men in the very late 90s, maybe even very early 2000s, right before Grant Morrison and Joe Casey started writing the X-Men. But for the most part, the villains that Claremont was using were new villains that were, in my opinion, not very good. They weren't very fleshed out. They weren't very interesting villains. It was just, hey, here's some bad guys that are brand new, and because Chris Claremont is creating them, you're supposed to care about them. But they never really jumped off the page like the characters that Claremont used to create back in the 1980s, or co-create, depending on who his artistic partner was. And I don't know if Claremont just realized that the old villains that he used to use were so much better and more interesting or not, but starting here, he starts using characters that either he used back in the 80s or he wanted to use back in the 80s. This collects, like I said, issues 444 through 449, I think I said that, and this is two story arcs, and the first story arc is The Fury, which is a character that Alan Moore and Alan Davis co-created on Captain Britain, and I've heard stories that Claremont wanted to use the Fury around the time of the Mutant Massacre, and then he was told no. I'm not sure what the deal was, if Alan Moore didn't want him to use the Fury, or if editorial didn't want him to use that character, but he was told no, and so he had to rearrange some of his ideas. So we got, I believe, Nimrod out of that, because he wasn't allowed to use the Fury. He created Nimrod, and he also used the Marauders in the Mutant Massacre. And I guess by this point, it was okay for him to go ahead and use the Fury, because Alan Moore hadn't been writing for Marvel Comics for like 25 years, so it was probably okay to use this character that Moore co-created. But basically, the Fury is in Captain Britain's house. The X-Men go to meet Captain Britain, and they have to fight this thing. And that's really all there is to it. There's no more plot to it than that. We don't know where the Fury came from. That's not explained here. We are told later on that the Fury did have a beef with Captain Britain, and that he tried to kill Britain in the past, and Britain was revitalized, I guess. But we really don't know where this creature came from, and we really don't know what its goal is beyond trying to hurt Captain Britain and the X-Men. There's really no plot to that story. And then the second story has Viper using Arcade's murder world to basically mess with the X-Men. She kidnaps this lady who works for the Queen of England and says, okay, you X-Men can either let this lady die, and she's the only one who can die, or if you try to save this lady, then a mini nuclear bomb is going to go off in Great Britain. And the X-Men naturally are spoilers. They're able to save the woman and prevent the bomb from going off. And the through line for this volume is basically human beings who see, yeah, these guys have badges, but we don't accept their authority here. And that's kind of the theme of this book. The X-Men are living in a world that it's a changed world. They now have authority, where before they were kind of just outlaws. It's a changed world, but the rest of the world won't accept that. And if there is any thematic through line of this book, that's it. I have to say, the good thing about this is that we get a lot of good character work here. Claremont's character work really needed a lot of fine-tuning in Extreme X-Men. There were some characters in that run who just did not work at all. Characters who I feel like he had a lot of plans for them, but then he would get rid of them and not do anything with them. Characters like not Sunspot, Thunderbird 3. Thunderbird 3, Lifeguard, Slipstream, those characters were in Extreme X-Men not very long, for like 2 volumes, and then they leave the series without ever really doing anything. And I feel like the character interactions in this book work a lot better than they did in Extreme X-Men. Really, this feels like a return to form for Chris Claremont. If you're a huge fan of his work in the 1980s, you're going to like this book. The big difference between this and, say, anything that he wrote in the 80s is that in the 1980s, you had really good character work, you had really good character interactions, just strong characters in general, and you also had interesting stories and interesting villains. Here, we don't have any of that. The stories are not very interesting here. In fact, every story here is retreading something that has happened in the 1980s. The Fury trying to kill Captain Britain and other mutants, that's something from the Captain Britain comics from the 1980s. And then Viper and Murder World, those are 2 very classic and I say classic, those are characters that Claremont can almost not resist using. There's a handful of characters that anytime Claremont is on any title, he will use those characters. Courtney Ross is another one. It seems like he can't stop using her, and she shows up here in a subplot that doesn't really make any sense to me at all, but I won't talk about that until it becomes more prevalent in this series. But basically, this has everything that a good Chris Claremont comic from the 80s would have, like the good characters and stuff, but the villains are just kind of there. The villain stories don't really seem that interesting, and the villains themselves are barely even fleshed out. If you've never read a comic book with Viper before, you're not really going to care about what she's doing here. She's just a means to the characters having different interactions with each other. They mention this previous story where Sage had an encounter with Viper, but I don't even know where that was. I don't know if that was in Extreme X-Men. I don't think it was. I don't remember her being in Extreme X-Men. I do remember now. She was in the Invasion storyline. Wow. Reading this book, I could not even remember the Invasion storyline happening. She was in Madripoor during that Invasion storyline where Khan wanted to marry Storm. So, yeah, she was in Extreme X-Men, but that had been like 4 years before this storyline happened. So, anyone who is just picking this up for the first time, maybe this was their first time reading an X-Men comic, or maybe they have been a long-time X-Men reader, but they never read Extreme X-Men, they might be a little confused about what's going on here. A lot of people were probably confused about what was going on here. I do think that this run gets better over time. I do remember a couple of storylines in this run being kind of stinkers, but overall, I do think this run is better than Extreme X-Men. I guess I'll see if that holds true or not after I read the rest of the run, or the rest of this run, but overall, I would say that The End of History is an okay book. It's better than a lot of the other X-Men books that were coming out around this time. Like, it's better than anything by Chuck Austen from the X-Men, better than anything by Peter Milligan. It's better than a lot of what Claremont was doing on Extreme X-Men. So it's an above-average comic from around this time. The problem is, average from around this time was really not very good. So that's not saying a whole lot about this story. But it was alright. So those were my thoughts on The End of History. I hope that you guys liked this review. If you did, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe. And for the next few weeks, I will be covering Chris Claremont's Uncanny X-Men run. And I hope that you guys will look forward to that. And also, I do other videos throughout the week, so you should check those out if that's what you're into. In the meantime, I will see you guys later in the week. Have a great rest of the day.